Okay, we have just time for one more question, so we'll take number 5. We're already running over 10 minutes late. Yes, go ahead.
Gentlemen, let me take his spot.
Okay. I don't know if we allow that, but I guess the grandmother you in.
Okay, thank you. I became interested in you, Jill, and the other third parties, because my family went Democratic decades ago. I'm from this area, and I became very disenfranchised. I'm a trade unionist in the area. And
Me too.
I know. And I remember a long time ago when Democrats used to come to us, and now I see it, our unions crawling to them. And I became totally disenfranchised with it. And it's, the more I'm getting to learn about you, the more I'm becoming interested and hopeful. I remember when I used to be middle class. Now middle class is $250,000 to $300,000. That's what both parties consider middle class. So dealing with the old middle class and the working people, short term, what do you have to offer? Because that's one group I'm not hearing people in the industry, workers, from all that. I got hurt in a car wreck, and this guy that does my massage was talking about how he was getting screwed over by people before. And he knew that I'm in a union, and he said, I wish I could be in a union. So please extol some areas that you have for that, because I talk to people at work and they don't know anything. They think green as tree under green.
Yeah.
So that's,
Right.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, we talk about an economy that works for everyday people, and that means the middle class, working class, poor, sort of the 99%. You know, most of us who are being pushed further and further over the edge towards poverty. And that's a broad agenda. The Green New Deal, really is about an economy that works for everyday people. So that includes strengthening unions, for example. It includes actually passing the Employee Free Choice Act, which Obama has promised. And in fact, every labor priority for the past many decades has been ignored by all Democratic presidents and all Democratic Congresses. In fact, ever since the labor movement and the AFL decided to go with the Democratic Party in 1936, it has been about face and downhill for the labor movement ever since, which I think speaks volumes about what it means to surrender to a corporate political party rather than an independent party. When labor had its own small independent parties and was able to really fight the good fight out in the street and politically, it was much more successful than when it joined the Democratic Party and allowed itself to be suffocated. And that's been going on for decades. So, we're talking about an agenda that really is for working people, that calls for the Employee Free Choice Act, that speaks out against this so-called right to work states, which is essentially a right to work for less, about speaking out in support of the movement for collective bargaining, the struggle in Wisconsin, which the president completely ignored, sent one tweet the night before the election that was attempting to throw out Governor Walker. Now, the president and the Democratic Party have essentially just turned their back on the struggles of working people. We call for Medicare for all, which would take so much of the burden off of working people trying to negotiate for decent benefits, for decent health care. This would make health care independent of your job. Right now, people get locked into their jobs because they're afraid to go without health care. But if you had health care, wasn't dependent on your job, you would have far more power to negotiate and to say no to your employer, and you wouldn't be, sort of held hostage by your health care plan. What else? We call for public higher education, which is free, and that's something that the middle class desperately needs now because families are going into debt. Not just students, but families are going into debt now in the effort to give their kids a decent shot at economic security. So we basically, through the Green New Deal, we offer really a broad plan that provides economic security, and to go with that, we call for taxing the rich. We call for a Wall Street sales tax, basically. Why should Wall Street be the only sector of the economy that doesn't pay a sales tax? People in this room are paying, what, 8 or 10% sales tax. Wall Street pays none. So if we put a 0.5% sales tax on Wall Street transactions, it would slow down the reckless gambling and the betting that takes place on Wall Street. It would encourage real investment, sound investment, rather than just pure speculation, and it would bring in $350 billion that would go a long way. We are calling also for worker cooperatives. The Green New Deal calls for public service jobs, public sector jobs, so that if you don't have a job, you can go down to an employment office, not an unemployment office, but an employment office and get a job. And what that does is put much more pressure on employers to actually provide decent wages and benefits, because if people have a public alternative, then they can't exert sort of the threats that they can use now against working people in terms of throwing you out on the street. So having that public sector job, it provides enormous support and bargaining power for working people. We're also calling for support for worker cooperatives, so we have a more diversified economy that's no longer this phony economy of high finance and crony capitalism and disaster capitalism, but begins to shift some of the real economic power into the hands of working people. So you have both unions, which are strengthened, but in addition you have worker ownership, so that workers actually have the choice of being able to join enterprises that are worker run and where decisions are made by workers as well. So it's a broad agenda that we offer for working people to create an economy that actually works for us, not just for the 1%.
Okay. This is a handout that has information on the Green New Deal in detail.
And yeah, I really encourage everyone to read about the Green New Deal. It is really a comprehensive pro-worker, pro-student, pro-ordinary person, pro-working class campaign. And likewise, our local campaign, if you look at our flyer, is calling for a massive program of green, unionized living wage jobs. But to add to some of the points that came out in the question, which I'm really glad it has come up, because it really points to one of the main tasks that we have on our hands. I mean, we all know, I'm assuming that because you all not only come here, but you've stayed here for well over an hour and a half, that means that we have some agreement on the need to change society and need for a dramatic shift in what's happening, rejection of corporate oligarchy. But we need to move beyond that and identify what are the tasks ahead of us, what are the strategies we need to adopt, and what are some of the most important changes we have to make in order to have mass movements grow. And one big, huge bear that we have is the labor movement, which is, it's ironic in the sense that on the one hand, the labor movement is hugely shackled by labor leadership in general, that has been so co-opted by the ruling elite, by the ruling class over decades. This is not something that happened in one day. And yes, Reagan's, the neoliberal era and attack on the airline workers union, and all those were watershed events in this movement against labor. But it didn't start with Reagan. This has been a long-standing process. I mean, the point is that this is the way an oppressive system like capitalism works. If you look at the history, some of the labor history, when the first unions were being formed, when the idea of a union was being formed, they used to be called combinations at that time, many people who were the initiators, the initial organizers, the leading members of these groups that were trying to organize workers because they realized that all workers individually are powerless, but in an organized way we can be hugely powerful because there's so many more of us. But the initial response of the corporate bosses was actually brutal. I mean, many of these leaders were killed, maimed, they were threatened, their families were kidnapped. There was a huge backlash against it. But as we know, the system creates its struggle. Because the system unleashes so much misery, it ensures that no matter how much backlash there is against revolt, people will revolt. So ultimately, the corporate bosses were not able to stop the formation of unions. Unions were formed. In fact, the 1930s were just an amazing and absolutely brilliant period of labor movements. But then what happens? When the ruling class cannot crush these movements, they will try to co-opt them, which is exactly what has happened to labor leadership. And that is why, as you said, labor unions are in such shambles. But we have to recognize what's happening. First of all, the solution to that is not to reject the unions and start something else. What we need is an internal revolution within unions. And if you look at the Chicago Teachers Union and why it is that they won those phenomenal victories against Rahm Emanuel, it's because they had an internal, radical change where they said that, we don't want this whole business as usual where we're unquestioningly pouring all this energy into an agenda that is not working for us. Instead, we will radicalize, we'll form a left coalition within the union which will fight for our rights, actually fight, not just say that you're going to fight. And that's what we need. And we need to be clear that the fact that the Democratic Party is actually not on the side of labor is not a new thing. In fact, FDR, there's this big myth about Roosevelt, FDR being on the side of labor. Actually, he has gone down in history as the president that called the National Guard on striking workers more times than any other president in the history of the United States. And of course, that was because he was the president at the time where labor movements were the strongest. But the point is that the Democratic Party is as much an enemy of labor as Republicans are. And we, as rank and file union members, have to start that internal, dramatic shift within the union. Frank Chopp, our opponent, by the way, also did something similar. The State Labor Council was angry at him for not being on the side of workers and actually actively working against workers on a bill that was going to protect workers' rights against retaliation by their bosses for unionizing or talking about unions. And Chopp totally betrayed workers on that. And the State Labor Council was very angry, and Chopp called the State Patrol on the leading members of the State Labor Council. This is FDR all over again. So we as union members, rank and file members, have to reject the tied at the hip nature of the unions with the Democratic Party. And you're right, the labor leaders go crawling to the Democratic Party. It is shameful. SEIU president, national president, she said that Obama is the president of the 99%. No, hell, he's not. He's the president of the 1%. And we need to be talking about that.